And I'm going to go to our syllabus. And I thought the first thing that we could do tonight is kind of see where we're at on the syllabus and talk about what's going to be due and where we are in the semester. All right, so let's look at content. Let me share this. Okay, so this is your basic syllabus on your D2L. And I want to look at the timeline right here. And so as you can see, let's see, is this week week 6 and then next week's week 7? Is that correct? So we have class next week and then we have spring break. I just want to make sure that's right. Okay, so this week we're talking about Gestalt, and next week we're going to be doing two things. We're going to be talking about choice theory and reality therapy. They're both by William Glasser and Wobelding. But I'm also going to be handing out the exam. Now, so let's talk about that specifically. Now, normally, sometime over the weekend, depending on how many links I have to rewrite or reconnect, either Saturday or Sunday, maybe even Friday if I have time, I post the week. So you are going to be getting everything for choice theory and reality therapy sometime this weekend for next week. Okay. And there's also going to be a place on D2L that's going to show you the exam. So here's the main thing. Okay. There will be instructions for the exam in writing, but next Thursday, I'm going to go over everything verbally with you in this class next Thursday about the exam. So don't panic, all right? You can start on the exam. It's no problem. But the exam is open book. It's take home, of course, on D2L. It's open notes. You just can't use the internet, okay? And it's not due until that Thursday, the week after spring break. So you'll have plenty of time to do this exam, okay? So just try not to panic when Saturday or Sunday D2L is open for the week and you're like, oh, there's an exam. Okay, you've got plenty of time. We'll go over it next Thursday. You'll get to ask me questions. It's open book, open notes. And what's the worst thing that could happen? Maybe you have to redo it, right? There's no failure. So, try not to freak out. All right. This is all about helping you to learn these theories and finding success in that journey. All right. So I'm already getting some videos and from different presenters, and I will post those as well. I usually set aside Friday afternoons to look at your discussions, your discussion posts, give you feedback. Think I'm like a week behind in that, but I'm trying to catch up. And those are also Friday afternoons. Those are the days I'm going to look at your presentations that you hand in, put in your Dropbox, and I'll give you written feedback for those tomorrow as well if you've handed those in. And the one thing I do have to be careful of is sometimes students get things a little incorrect on those. So I don't want to actually post them to the class until I make sure everything's okay. I just don't want there to be any misunderstandings with the class, but I also want the class to watch them. Okay. So I just like to watch them first. Sometimes students may use some crazy language or have a character that's a little off, or I just want to make sure everything's okay before I post them. And then I'll give you feedback. All right. So I think that's it as far as where we are right now. And, spring break is about halfway through. And that's when we have our first exam, the week before and the week after. You have lots of time to do that exam. And next Thursday, we'll go over the exam together. And just to make sure I answer all of your questions. But if you email me questions about the exam before next Thursday, my answer is going to be, we're going to go over the exam Thursday so that I can answer them verbally, because a lot of times in order to answer your detailed questions about the exam, it would take a long answer, so I'd rather just talk to you all about it and answer your questions about the exam once you see it in front of you and we're all together in one place on Zoom. All right, but now, so that's kind of where we are in the big picture of the semester. I think everybody so far has gotten full credit for their discussion boards that I've read. And even though it's only 2 points or so per discussion board, it adds up to be like 20% of your grade. So it's worthwhile putting some time into those. But everybody's doing a great job answering the discussion boards. But any questions about kind of where we are in the big picture of the semester, what's going to be due after this? After this first exam, the two big projects are a final paper and a final exam. And they're both take home, open book, open note as well. You'll continue doing discussion boards. You're not going to have a discussion board when you take your exam, because I think the exam's going to be enough. So we only have 10 discussion boards for a 15-week semester. So don't worry if you don't see a discussion board when I hand out the exam. Okay, that's why. I just want you to focus on one thing, the exam. You're not going to have a discussion board when you write your final paper either. The only thing that you may have to work on at the same time as the exam is if you have a video presentation. Some of those might be due. But other than that, I try to keep you focused on one assignment at a time, if possible. All right. So any questions about any of that? And like I said, the worst thing that could happen is I ask you to rewrite the exam. That's it. There's no failure. It's fix it, hand it in again. So, all right. So let's talk about Gestalt, and I'm gonna share my notes in Gestalt because there's a couple things I just want to highlight for you. Okay, so these are the Gestalt notes. And the first thing I'd like to highlight is that the four Gestalt principles, holism, field theory, figure formation process, organismic self-regulation, you need to know those, but you don't need to know them for my exam. But you do need to know them for the comps and the NCE. A lot of times people say, well, I'm going to use the figure formation process and I'm going to show my clients some figure ground pictures. These are not techniques. These are not things that Pearls would do with a client. This is how he came up with some of the ideas behind his theory. So don't use these as techniques. The figure formation process. So you saw the picture of two faces looking at each other, or the vase in the middle, the cup. And unfinished business is like the background. So if you see the cup, the background would be this black. And you'd see the cup, you wouldn't see the two faces. But through experiments, he would bring out unfinished business. And the ground, the black ground and the background would move forward. And you would be able to recognize unfinished business. And then you would focus on the unfinished business, which would be the two faces. And the current things in your life would fade to the background. So through experiments, he simply wanted to bring forward unfinished business so that you could work on it in therapy. Okay? And that's his explanation of how he understands that. And but it's not a technique that you would use in therapy. One thing you do need to talk about in your exam is the 5 main types of resistances to contact. I think you should have found them very similar to Freud's defense mechanisms. Another thing to talk about is, where is your client as far as understanding the layers of the human personality? Is he at the phony layer, the phobic, impasse? Probably not at the implosive or explosive yet. So you're going to probably walk your client through the phony and phobic layers of the personality by using experiments. All right, and let's talk about some of the techniques or experiments. One of the big mistakes that people make with Gestalt is they like all the experiments or techniques, call them experiments because that's what Pearls called them. But there's hundreds of them, literally thousands of techniques from Gestalt therapy. The problem is they bring out a lot of emotions. So you usually have to do them sometime in the therapeutic process where you have a lot of time to process them. And you do have to process each experiment with the client. What self-awareness was the result of doing this experiment with me? So This is just a handful of experiments. And remember, don't just jump into an experiment. You have to talk with the client, talk about layers of the personality, where they are, what's the unfinished business, what's the underlying issue, and then do a technique. And that's with any theory. You can't just jump into a technique. There's a lot more to therapy than just jumping into a technique. So you've got to have that first part of the therapeutic process and then use a technique. In fact, you're going to be required to use two techniques with your client. You have to process both of them with the client. So some of these techniques are really simple, and some have a lot more detail and discussion. So, for instance, body language is very similar to, it's not just looking at the body language, it's discussing the body language, processing it, asking them to repeat or exaggerate a body movement, asking them, what are you doing with that? Or like I like to do, if somebody was maybe wiggling their foot, if your foot could talk right now, what would it say? So it's not just simply observing their body language, it's interacting with the client. I statements. So many times people, when they experience an anxiety-producing situation, they like to say the word you instead of taking ownership of the anxiety. So I see it on the news all the time. They say, well, when you experience such a devastating event, you feel helpless. Well, maybe I do, maybe I don't, but you're talking about yourself. Please use I statements. When I experience such a devastating event, I experience the feeling of helplessness. So it makes the client take ownership of what they're saying. Those are pretty simple. I'd like you to use at least one detailed, in-depth experiment, such as role play or empty chair or top dog versus underdog. So my favorite out of those is doing a role play and then doing a role reversal. You're going to be tempted to have the client confront their father because, the father was domineering and maybe not the best dad, abandoned the client at a certain age. It does no good to have the client pretend to talk with his father. The father's not there. And if the father would talk with him in real life, he might not get a nice reaction. He's not in control of what the father says. So usually what I do is I don't have them address things in the past. I have them address things in the present. And right now, your client is probably going to be conflicted between two parts of themselves. One part that wants to please the expectations that were placed upon them growing up, and one part that wants to truly be themselves and genuine and not be phony. But it's so difficult for them to change because they fear phobic rejection. And they've been stuck. They've come to an impasse. So I want to help them move past that impasse, to no longer fear rejection, to understand that they deserve unconditional love and acceptance, positive regard. I want to move them to the final two layers of the personality. So you see how I included those first three layers of the personality in the role play. And the two people in the role play are two sides to themselves, two sides in their own mind. They're talking to themselves. It does no good talking to a father that's abandoned them, expressing their anger. What good does that do? Doesn't change anything. It's just venting. But helping them to move to the next layer of their personality, that promotes change because it facilitates personal awareness. All right. Don't use rehearsal. Don't use staying with the feeling. They're just too basic for an exam. It's good to use them in therapy, just not good for an exam. I'll just have you use another one and you'll end up rewriting it. All right. There are Gestalt institutes everywhere. That's kind of what I just wanted to highlight, that I wasn't sure whether or not I had mentioned those things in the recorded lecture. So I just wanted to make sure that I'd hit upon them either again or make sure you got that information. So how about questions about what I just shared?
I have a question. So with this theory, the focus is on the present. You're trying to bring your client into the present. My question is in terms of a diagnostic, if you're using this theory and you want to come up with a diagnosis on the patient, you really have to look to the past and the pattern. So is that something totally separate?
So you have to look at diagnosis differently. We don't use any theory before we use diagnosis assessment. So first I diagnose, then I choose a theory. So I think that's probably the misunderstanding. It's like, so in an assessment process, I don't use a theory. I have learned how to assess and diagnose. And then some theories are better for some diagnoses and some theories are better for other diagnoses. So I end up combining the best theory for the client. What else? So honestly, every theory almost, except for Freud, brings things into the present. It's just that Gestalt theory is the first one to really focus on that and to make that a main point of the theory. Most theories can look at the past, but they're not going to dwell on the past. They're going to ask, how does that past experience affect you as an individual in the present? You're no longer that person in the past. Now you're a person sitting with me right now. How did that experience affect who you are right now? So it doesn't matter, unless it's Freud, it doesn't matter what theory I use, I bring it into the present. It's just Gestalt emphasizes that. Nicole, do you have a question?
I'm sorry, the sun is in my eyes.
Okay. Hey, your life's so bright, you got to wear shades.
Right? I'm like right in the library and the sun's right in my face.
All right, good question. Other questions? So I'm going to say this again next Thursday when we go over the exam. But there's going to be 3 parts. And the first part is case history. So you're going to kind of examine the client's past. and what brought them to therapy. And then the big part of the question is, what are you going to do with the client in therapy in the present? And I would not dwell upon the father. The father's not in therapy with me. I talk about the client and where they are today and what they'd like to work on. And if they want to bring up something from the past, we bring it into the future. How is that affecting you today? What would you like to change? How would you like to grow? And then the last part of the question is about the future. It's a treatment plan. What are you going to do with the client in the future sessions? So we do have past, present, and future. All right, let's talk about Gloria. What did you think about Fritz Perls? Did I tell the story about my professor knocking Fritz Perls over a couch? Well, did you get a little better understanding of that after watching him? All right, so give me I'm going to read them in your discussion post, but give me your impressions of that. Go ahead, Chastity.
It was very interesting because I really it was cool being able to see Gloria being counseled by Rogers and then by Perls. He seemed very confrontational and at some points like mocking. And I was just like, if this was my therapist, I'd probably flip a table. Like I could definitely see her like getting uncomfortable and upset, and I completely understand why. He was definitely not my cup of tea.
There's a lot of smoking going on too.
Right.
Because she was more anxious.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Nicole, you had your hand up.
Yeah, their relationship was terrible. He was like so aggressive and she was uncomfortable the whole time. But I did see her grow during that time. So, I mean, he did accomplish something. It was just so aggressive.
What was the so there was one thing that both sessions had, and in Gloria and Rogers, she was talking about, boy, I wish I had somebody like you as a dad. And Rogers was like, well, I think you'd make a pretty nice daughter. But then Gloria said to Perls, I don't think you like me at all. And Perls is like, well, I like you as much as an artist brings out a work of art from like a piece of rock, if they were a sculptor or something like that. So it's a very different relationship that each of those theorists have with a client. I think one is much more personal without crossing any professional boundaries. Lucas, you got a comment or question?
Yeah, I was going to say with that comment from Perls, it was like he almost dehumanized the relationship between them. It was not, good at all to build or instill trust moving forward too.
I just don't think it wasn't as personal. Yeah. And, he distanced himself from her. Yeah. Do you think they got to the same place in a different way? Or do you think they got to a little different place? And what was that place they got to?
I feel like they both ended up at the relationship with her father, which I thought was interesting.
Okay, so they did both end up with the relationship with her father, but let's take that a step further. How did that relationship affect Gloria? So her father's not there, but Gloria is. So where did they get to with Gloria? Anybody?
I feel like they gave her more respect for herself.
So I think you can't, I think they encouraged her to have more respect for herself. She has to choose to respect herself. Yeah. Do you think, remember last week, we were talking about kind of codependency? Do you think that Pearls was like, he got to codependency as well? You're either so close or you're off in a corner. So you're either enmeshed or you're isolated. There's no middle ground. And I think he also got to the point where she didn't want to take responsibility for her personal decisions. So those are the three areas I think that they both got to, but they got there in a very different way. So the one thing I do want to say is that I use Gestalt therapy all the time. However, I don't act like Fritz Perls. So you can use Gestalt therapy, but you can be very kind and respectful to your clients. You don't have to act like Fritz Perls to use his theory. And I think that's one of the things people don't really realize is like, oh, I didn't like that theory. Well, really, they didn't like Fritz. But I've seen very kind and compassionate counselors use this in a very different way. I just like, if we only have one theory a week, I just like you to see the original person if possible, even if it's a little off the wall.
It makes me think what it would have been like to see Freud at work.
Yeah, I wonder about that because we really don't have any recordings of that. There may be an audio recording someplace, but yeah. So what other reactions do you have to either the theory, the notes, the lecture, or the Gloria tapes? Is there anything you're not sure of? Is there something you'd like to know more about that maybe wasn't explained fully? Do you have an emotional or cognitive reaction to the video you saw? Which would you rather have so far as a counselor, Rogers or Fritz?
Rogers.
Definitely Rogers.
Rogers.
Some people prefer, Pearls, but it's your own choice. The interesting thing is that later on, and it's not on I watched it, it's not on the YouTube video, but they asked Gloria, like, what she got from each theorist. And she said she liked Rogers the most, but she thought she grew the most from Pearls. So he was the most challenging, I guess.
I wanted to say that Pearls definitely made me nervous. I could never have a therapist like that. But I did once do a job interview where it was like that, and I left crying. I mean, I didn't cry in
Did
the
you get the
interview, but
job?
yes,
See?
and it's a job I have now. And he really did, because I work in like a tough, like Title I school where needs are high, and you know, I think he wanted to see if I could hold up. And so he just kept badgering and badgering. And I like didn't lose my temper, but the mask came off and I was like, look, I already said it. And how many other ways can I say it? Just, it is what it is. Take it or leave it. And not, I mean, I
Maybe
didn't
that's
stand
what
in
they
that.
wanted.
Yeah. And, you know, I like cried on my way home. I was like, I can't believe that happened. Like, why was he so mean? And then like he's on the school board. I see him at all these functions. He's like a nice person, but I think like they were just like trying to poke, and that was his personality or something. And so I didn't envy Gloria at all. I'll tell you that on that couch.
Yeah.
Must have-
So interestingly enough, when anybody goes to an interview, and I would say that the same thing happens in a counseling session, it's like the energy we put out is the energy we receive. So if I'm anxious, I'm going to make the person interviewing me anxious. If I'm anxious, I'm going to make my client anxious, you know? If my client comes in a bad mood and I'm very positive and encouraging, hopefully that mood will begin to change. So like when I go to an interview, I have a couple goals. I wouldn't be at the interview. Nobody would be at an interview if they weren't qualified. They're not going to call you in for an interview if you're not qualified. But my first goal is to make them laugh at least one time during the interview. My second goal is to be able to tell them an inspiring story in some way. And my third goal is by the end of the interview, I don't want them to think, oh, Grafton's so smart and qualified. That's not my goal of an interview. These people are going to be spending like 40 plus hours a week with me. I want them by the end of the video to say, you know, on a Friday after work, I could go have a beer with Grafton. That's the goal of the interview. I don't want my clients to say that.
I think a lot of it has to do with personality type too. I know there's a lot of people that will avoid conflict, you know, any way possible. So to be presented with that, you know, be forced to, it might be a positive thing. So it just, I think a lot of it would depend on the techniques and stuff that you're going to use about the client's personality. I think that would have a lot to do with it.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, and I am not a good person to be interviewed by, because I simply say, you know, I'm going to plumb the depths of your knowledge and see how much you know. And either I'll know more or you'll know more and I'll learn something. And I let them pick any theory they want. These are other professors, you know, and so they should know them. I let them pick any theory they want, and then we start to talk about it. It's amazing how many professors don't know theory. Like, how do you counsel people if you don't know a theory? So, all right. Anything else? We have plenty of time if you have questions about this theory or anything else.
I just wanted to bring up one point. When we had our discussion last week and we were talking about Gestalt, I thought we wanted to do the technique early on because it might bring out a lot of emotion. But you said tonight about going over the theory first and then doing the technique. So I just wanted to make sure we got our presentation right.
So you want to do it early in the session, but it's not going to be the first thing you do. So you just want to make sure you have enough time to process it. A lot of times people will take this exam and they'll say, let's start off with a technique. But really, there's so much more to talk about before you even decide what technique to try. In fact, if it was a real session, I'd want to talk with the person a little bit, figure out where they were in the layers of the personality, what their main issue was, what they needed to change positively, and then I'd choose the right technique for that. So you kind of have to figure those things out in order to choose the technique, but you got to do the technique early enough so that you can process all those emotions it brings up. So early, but not first. What else? All right, so tomorrow I'll go over some more discussion posts. I'll watch the videos that people handed in and give you some feedback. And this weekend, I'll post next week. I will post the exam. Don't freak out. You've got like weeks to do it, and we'll go over the exam next Thursday. Okay? It's not due till after spring break. All right. We'll see y'all later.
Yeah.
Have a good night.
You too.